Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know if he's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feeling pretty good about that?
In this episode, we hear from the team that traveled across North America to investigate new chemicals hitting drug supplies that could be responsible for a new wave of the overdose crisis.
Go!
Fentanyl is safe in my eyes compared to benzos and fent. People are dying without even having the tinfoil down. You know, they're taking a hoot and they're just dead.
We've started to see tranq come into the dope. People are getting extreme injuries and wounds. You can see down to the muscle tissue in the bone, large abscesses and infections where they're injecting.
This tranq is intense. Like you feel like you're literally gonna die.
The benzos are gonna kill a lot of people, and it already has. It's already started.
So thank you guys for joining me today. The piece Beyond Fentanyl is a really insightful examination and investigation of where the opioid crisis, if you want to call it that, has ended up, the human costs of it, policy decisions that may have added to it, and really just a phenomenon that I think a lot of people maybe understand in their gut, which is to say there's a lot of addiction in the United States, and putting some, and Canada, of course, putting some sort of figuring out why that's happening and how that's affecting people. So Manisha, I want to start with you because you've been covering drug use, addiction, both in Canada and the US for many years now. What inspired this particular investigation? What did you learn from it? And how has it sort of changed your perspective on reporting in this subject?
So this sort of jumped off of another piece that I was working on, which is this disappearance of heroin from North America's drug markets. And I noticed that drug users were expressing a lot of nostalgia for this old school heroin that they used to use and how they can no longer find it anymore. And so it's being replaced by fentanyl, rapidly in some cities like Vancouver. You can't get heroin at all anymore. It's all fentanyl. So initially that's what I was looking at. And once I started digging into that, drug users and dealers were telling me, well, it's not just that it's fentanyl, it's worse than fentanyl. There's these benzos that are being cut into the supply, and people with very, very high opioid tolerances were getting completely knocked out. They were driving their cars, on the highway, falling asleep, waking up not knowing where they were. There were reports of people getting robbed, getting sexually assaulted while on this super potent dope. So that's where I started wondering, okay, is there actually something that's worse than fentanyl on the street, and how pervasive is it? And once I started looking in Canada and BC, I realized this is actually really bad. In some places, more than half of their opioid supply is contaminated with benzos. And then I started thinking about, okay, is this also happening in the US? And that's what sort of led me to the Philly case study, where a lot of their dope, a lot of their opioids have been infiltrated with very strong animal tranquilizers.
And Gilad, there's kind of a continuum, if you would, between the opioid epidemic as started by maybe prescription medications to heroin to fentanyl, and your piece kind of tracks where it's going from there. Were you surprised with what you found?
Yeah, it was really shocking for me personally. I had read Manisha's article and was very surprised to hear that people could not get heroin anymore, and that Pandora's box had been opened and the supply is continuing to shift further and further away. And when the US hit the grim milestone of over 100,000 deaths because of drugs and opioids in particular, we wanted to figure out how can we do something that's additive and not just kind of chasing what has been reported. I think a lot of news organizations are starting to focus now on fentanyl as being that major driver. And while it is still a predominant driver of that number, we are starting to look a little bit more forward thinking into where is this going? And while fentanyl still is the predominant cause of these deaths, some of these new substances that are being cut into the fentanyl are particularly scary because of some of the things that Manisha outlined, that it's not just the overdoses, it's the inability for drug reversals like naloxone and Narcan to be able to reverse the overdose because benzodiazepines don't respond to naloxone. So we were taking a more of a narrow view into what's going on with this crisis right now. And it's no longer really an opioid crisis anymore because of these substances that are being added to the supply, infiltrating the supply.
Patrick, what was it like for you? I mean, one thing I thought is really significant about the work you guys did was the human element, talking with people, being with them in their spaces, respecting, in some senses, that this is something that they do, and inquiring about it without being sort of judgmental in that way. And I think that's been a hallmark of Vice's drug coverage since I was doing it too, you know? But I was really struck by how personal and how open everyone was with you guys as a team.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most important things when we were discussing the edit, was that I wanted to make sure that we humanized this population that is so often dehumanized, you know, that are cast as other. And so between like the edit and the music, I like each moment that we jump into these people's lives, it's like, you know, we take these like brief glimpses into their lives, and they continue on. Like our character Keisha does a great job of kind of bringing us into the world of what's going on with the supply. She has all these people in her life that are also users. So like, you know, she can kind of talk about that like human element.
Just on this last note, like a decision we made early on, all three of us had this conversation that we've seen so many drug documentaries use what I would call needle porn, where there's just like such an emphasis on the drug use. We have one very like dramatic scene of drug use, which is really important, and that's more important because of how we follow up with that subject later. It's not really about just seeing them use drugs, but understanding how their drug use plays a part in their life, and then going beyond just that moment of visual striking, like a striking moment, seeing like, all right, this person nearly overdosed on camera. We're not just gonna leave him in that moment at his worst. We're gonna try to follow up with him the next day and have a follow-up conversation. So I think that's part of the edit, that's part of the production, and the conversations we had about how do we go beyond identifying these individuals as not just drug users, but as people, and not just seeing them at their worst, trying to push to follow up with them.
And I think Keisha, the character in British Columbia who was cooking fentanyl without benzos and had something of a community, like it was an ad hoc community service organization is one way of looking at it. Another way is she deals drugs. And I think one thing I was really struck by, especially as it's the first scenes of the film, is it communicates a point of view about how you're gonna deal with this subject, which is to say, you're there to learn, not necessarily to be like, yo, you're giving these people fentanyl. Like another character might say, hey, you should be charged with murder for doing this. However, you're there to understand the community and the ad hoc communities that are formed in response to maybe a lack of formal government assistance and help for people. So talk to me about that, because I think that was a really interesting choice to begin the film with, both because you understand the breadth of maybe what's happening in BC, but it also shows that she thinks, Keisha, that she's doing things the right way. And, you know, it's kind of hard to consider when it comes to addiction and drugs, like, is there a right way, is there a wrong way? So it as a viewer, it made me have to contend with those ideas, which I thought was really rich, and it cashed out in a really interesting way.
I think that there is a binary when you look at how drug dealers are presented in the media. It's, you know, the drug user, person with an addiction is sort of portrayed as a victim. The drug dealer is portrayed as an evil person. But the reality of drug reporting is that there's no academic, there's no books that will teach you what is happening with the supply chain. You have to go to the sellers and the users, but the sellers really to get a clear understanding of what is happening. And I think you're absolutely right that we were there to learn from Keisha. You know, she has a front row seat to this change in the supply. She's been dealing for 20 years. And she took us into her sort of underworld. And it was interesting to see that she was not only supplying people with what she considers to be a safer version of the drug they want to use, but really she was sort of a community fixture. You know, they were relying on her for emotional support, for housing, for food. You know, we saw her, like, I've seen her come home with pizza for people. So I think that yeah, it was maybe a less sort of judgmental approach to interviewing her and shadowing her. And I think that the knowledge that she had to share is pretty important, to the wider understanding of what is happening to the drug supply here in North America.
The benzos are gonna kill a lot of people, and it already has, it's already started, and everything is cut with it. Everything. It's very hard to find somebody who you can trust to get just raw fent and not cut with any benzos. Fentanyl is safe in my eyes compared to benzos and fent.
That's a shocking statement, though, for you to say that fentanyl, which has killed thousands, hundreds of thousands at this point of people, and you're saying that it's safe compared to this new dope that you're seeing.
Yeah, way more safer.
Were you worried when you were there, like in the house with Keisha, when you were on the streets in Philadelphia? Worried not maybe for your physical safety, but worried for the unforeseen outcomes that could happen in these situations? Because it is very, real.
I would definitely say there were moments that felt tense or that felt uncomfortable. We, after all, are putting a lot of trust into Keisha. She is a dealer. When we're following her around at night, and I don't necessarily know Abbotsford particularly well, and she is making drug deals. She's also picking up drugs, which is maybe the bigger concern because she's then going a step above her in the supply chain. And these are people who are unknowns to us. So I think that there were certainly moments that were tense and uncomfortable. And I think her house itself, there's people coming and going constantly. There's a lot of trauma. There are a lot of things that these people have experienced, a lot of death. And so it's chaotic, and you also are very aware of your own presence there and that you're sort of imposing on this group of very marginalized and traumatized people. And sometimes that is, frankly, uncomfortable. So that's sort of how I would say I felt. Gilad may feel a bit differently.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of concern. There's concern over the 16-year-old who we meet. Her name is Carrie.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of concern of seeing someone in the middle of a crisis who is not only dealing with the addiction, not only dealing with what she ends up telling us and sharing with us is that she experienced an assault that she believes happened while she was knocked out on benzodope. But she's also dealing with years of just trauma and not necessarily having other avenues to process that trauma or to talk about it. And, we had conversations about, she felt safe and comfortable enough to share her story with Manisha, which is a testament to building trust in the relationship that you did and the team did with these subjects, but also what happens the next day? What happens when she leaves and she doesn't have a safe space that she could go to open up and talk about some of these really difficult experiences that she's gone through. So we still think about all of these subjects and do have a lot of concern for what happens next. Because as Pat said earlier, their lives continue to live outside of the framework of this documentary. And what about putting them on television, sharing their story, and our presence, how does that impact their lives and what happens to them next?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Americans and American journalists who are still talking about Purdue Pharma and OxyContin and sort of the pill mill crisis. And the reality is that we are now way beyond that in this crisis. And now we are fully into a synthetic drugs crisis that's primarily driven by fentanyl. And I think that when Jim Carroll became Trump's drug czar, he put a lot of pressure on China and succeeded in getting them to ban fentanyl. But that ban, while shipments of finished fentanyl from China to the US did drop that year, Mexican cartels then started just getting the precursors, synthesizing it themselves and trafficking it back into the US. And now that crisis is worse than ever before. But the other thing that happens is when there are disruptions to the fentanyl supply, it's just so easy now to find other research chemicals that will mimic the effects of the fentanyl, but perhaps will have really bad outcomes on a person's body, on the user's body. And so that's what we're sort of starting to see happen. And I think you could argue that had we regulated opium, or had we regulated heroin even, and had a safer supply of some of these drugs, milder versions of these drugs, we may not be in the same situation we are today. If you look at cannabis legalization, when we legalized cannabis, what became really popular? CBD, microdosing, like a lot of milder forms of the drug became really popular because you've given people stable options. And I think one of the saddest parts about this is that we're looking at a population who has no options at all, and they're essentially guinea pigs for whatever suppliers are going to cut into the supply, and policy plays a big role in that.
Part of the documentary frames Keisha. She would refer to herself as an ethical dealer, and there are other countries like Switzerland which have prescription heroin programs. In Canada, they've started prescribing fentanyl, safe doses of fentanyl. So she sees herself as just an extension of what is becoming increasingly, still controversial, but increasingly more acceptable in other countries. So it was actually a piece that Manish had reported previously on safer supply and organizations handing out drugs that got Keisha to be interested in participating in this documentary, saying, I'm pretty much just doing another extension of that harm reduction work.
Well, and that speaks to sort of the continuity of coverage that you've been able to do over the years and that we've all been able to do on drugs, which is like, we don't look at drugs as something that should be sensationalized to the point of demonizing the people who are doing it, who are selling it, who are part of the industry. It is because it is part of being human. And once you start covering that through that lens, you can get better access to people who are inside that world and are trying to change it, in their opinion, for the better.
Exactly. And I mean, just going back to sort of the abstinence idea as well, I think that there has to be an understanding that a lot of these people will never be abstinent, and that's just reality. And reality is that people will always use drugs. And so are you going to essentially sentence people to die because you don't want to accept that idea, because it doesn't fall in line with your sort of moral worldview? And I think that, that does sort of make the case for having more of these safe supply programs, or even safe injection sites where people can use and at least be revived if they do overdose. Because it's just dealing with the reality on the ground, not this sort of fantasy where we want everybody to enter treatment, which is just not going to happen.
And you've reported on some of those safe injection sites that are happening throughout the US as well.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the one in New York, and they were so happy to be able to open and finally be above ground because they were operating illegally before. But unfortunately, there's still only a couple of them for all of the US, and we have over 100,000 Americans who have died in 1 year. So, Biden's new drug strategy, he doesn't mention safe injection sites, doesn't mention safe supply.
So the location that you went to, is it legal?
The one in New York?
Yeah.
It's legally sanctioned by the city of New York, which means that they won't rate it.
Right.
But it's federally illegal because of this crack house statute, which basically says you can't operate any space that's going to be used for illegal drugs. And actually, Biden was, I believe, the author of that statute. So they have, on a federal level, they have not done anything about that yet.
What do you think that lawmakers, policymakers, community leaders are getting wrong about what's happening today with drugs and addiction? Because I think it's not like people aren't paying attention to it. It just seems like it's an easy place to score some talking points, but solutions, as we know, aren't particularly easy to get to. So as a closing thought, what you guys have learned in this reporting project, what would you say to policymakers about what to do to reduce outcomes of harm, to reduce death?
I would say treat the people who use the drugs and who sell the drugs as experts, because they know better than anybody else what is going on with the drug supply and how it's impacting people. So pay attention to that. And the focus is still very heavily on supply and reducing supply, and also treatment. That's the dichotomy. And I think we really need to focus more on the solutions, as radical, as controversial as they may be, that these drug users are telling us are going to save lives. And that includes giving them a safe space to use drugs, and that may include giving them safe drugs to use. Because at this point, they're overdosing because sometimes they have no idea what they're even taking. So that would be my thought.
How about for you, Patrick?
I think ultimately this kind of goes back to what you were saying before about, people having different drug choices. We treat this problem, whether it's opioids or fentanyl or now benzodope and trank dope, there's this lack of the understanding because it seems so foreign, and I think you see the effects that it has on the body, and I think that's a very shocking thing to understand how we can let this keep going. But one of our subjects, Sarah, mentions like alcohol and cigarettes are killing more people, and we have an understanding for those people, and there are treatment options for those people that are way more abundant.
Yeah.
And I think that if we treat these people with the same respect that we treat people that are more traditionally accepted, then we might find a solution out.
Well, I appreciate the reporting, guys, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk and really just approaching this from the basis of respect, humanity, and seeing people as they are. I think that's a really important thing to do, and it's hard because it's actually hard to report on this stuff, and I really appreciate the work you guys have done.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.